welcome back, everybody. It has been such a long time since I have done an actual review video. I think the last video that I made even about the books I've been reading was my His Dark Materials video, which was a commentary and reflection video. So my last review video was Skyward, I think, which was back in like April. So it's been a minute, but I'm so happy to be back to doing another review video. Today, I'm going to be talking about none other than the Green Bone Saga by Fonda Lee. This took me forever to finish, but it was so, you can see why, clearly, but so worth it. I'm super excited to talk about these. I really wish I had done a review video for each individual book, but it just worked out where I didn't have the time and it took me so much longer to finish the whole series, so the schedule that I had in mind just didn't end up panning out. But we're here now. I'm going to talk about it in as much depth as I can, which isn't much at this point, but I'm excited to give a review. I loved these and I'm happy to talk about them. So let's go ahead and get right on into it. So like I did for the Skyward series review, because this is also a series review, I'm going to give a brief summary of what you can expect from this book if you've not read it, talk about the various categories that I usually go through in detail, give you an overarching idea and sentiment that I have, some just general thoughts I have for each of those categories. So that will comprise the spoiler-free review part of this video, and then I will talk a little bit about my spoiler-filled thoughts. I don't have a ton this time because, again, I've read them so far apart and over such a longer stretch of time now that I don't have as many detail-specific things to talk about in that respect, but talk about a few things that stood out to me that I have been thinking about ever since I finished them. Yeah, and then we'll wrap up. I'll talk about things to look forward to, and that'll be that. So again, it is one of those days where I did not have time to really solidify in my brain the summary that I wrote, so I'm going to read it to you. The award-winning Green Bone Saga by Fonda Lee takes place in the city of Janloon on the island of Kakon, where Jade grants preternatural abilities to those who can handle its power, and where the clans dictate the rule of the people. Comprised of Jade City, Jade War, and Jade Legacy, the trilogy follows the Call family of the No Peak clan and their fight against the rival Mountain clan over the course of several years. On the surface, the Green Bone Saga is a mafia story set in an urban fantasy world, but beneath the bloody and action-packed plot, it is a poignant examination of family loyalty in the midst of strife and an ever-changing world. To get into my spoiler-free thoughts, like I said before, I will go category by category. My usual categories that I use to rate books are character, plot, writing style, setting and immersion, and pacing. So getting right on into it with character. Every single character in this series is multifaceted, layered, complex, very, very human. Even the ones you're not rooting for, even the ones you don't like, you understand that it's because they are a complex person. You get their motivations. Again, even if you think they're disgusting and you don't like them, you see their complexities, and it is one of the strongest selling points I have for this trilogy is how well written these characters are. It is a fantastic ensemble cast. It is a very large ensemble cast. There are so many named characters in this book. It can feel a little bit overwhelming at times. There is a handy-dandy list of characters at the front of each book, I believe, or at least in the last couple that I noticed. So that's very useful, but even though there were so many named characters and it could feel a bit overwhelming at times, the main players were so unique and distinct in their roles, it was easy to keep track of the central characters that you were paying attention to, which I really appreciated. Again, being a reader of fantasy, I'm used to large casts, I'm used to a lot of named characters, but there's just so many. There were times where I was like, I don't know who you are. But I had my handy-dandy little guide, or it was one of those things where I could piece together from the context, oh right, you're from this area, you're from this group, you're from this plot line, and I could put the pieces together. So very, very expertly done in that way as well. It did take me a little while to feel emotionally invested in the characters, not for any fault of writing of the characters or of the series as a whole, but just because the character types that I normally gravitate towards emotionally weren't super present in the series. Not that they weren't there, just that they weren't super present. So it did take me a little bit to feel emotionally invested and attached to these characters, but over time they really grew on me and I ended up really loving so many of them. Again, it's just so well written that you cannot help but to end up falling in love with some of these characters, even if they're not necessarily the sort of characters that you would usually root for or gravitate towards. I think I felt very similarly to the Poppy War books, where I had my couple that I really, really liked and I felt really attached to, but my immediate reaction at the beginning wasn't to be super emotionally invested personally in the characters, even though I was interested in them. I thought they were interesting to read about. And then over time, as the series progressed, I got really attached. It was the same kind of feeling here, where in the first book, I thought, wow, these are really neat characters. I love the way they're written. Don't necessarily absolutely adore any of them, but I'm very fascinated by them. I care about their story and I want to know what happens. To the end of, book 3, where I'm almost in tears over these characters and things that they're going through. So again, it's just very well done. The zeroing in on the Call family in particular, I think, is the selling point for the series for me. It's what made me love these books on the whole. The way that the thematic importance of the story is carried through the various perspectives within this family, it's ultimately what grabbed my heart the most. By the end of the series, just you will love this family and you will want them to succeed and you will ache for their tragedies and their heartaches, and you're just rooting for them. You care about them. So I think it really was the zeroing in on this particular family and all their different dynamics and all their different roles within the family unit that ended up making this work so well. So yeah, character, fantastic. I have very few, if any, complaints on that front. Next up is plot. This is one of the elements I probably struggled with the most, next to pacing, which I'll talk about later. It's not that the plot was bad, just that there were more things here that I either struggled to comprehend entirely or that I struggled to care about. And this wasn't so much in the first book as it was in the last 2. The first book, I think the plot was really solid for me, and then books 2 and 3, I struggled a little bit more with it. While there is always something happening plot-wise, that is something I will say is a strength of the series. Even in those tiny scenes where you feel like not much is happening, something is happening. She is setting something up to happen. So there's always something happening plot-wise, but there were a lot of subplots that it took me a while to care about, or that I felt really dragged the pacing and the overall main plot down. So yeah, eventually everything, all these different subplots in the main plot, everything has its payoff, and it is ultimately satisfying, but a lot of them weren't necessarily worth it to me in the moment. And even by the end, I kind of felt like, okay, not all of them, but enough where I felt this was one of the elements that I struggled with the most while reading. I mostly felt this in the final book though, a little bit in book 2 as well, but book 3 was the most difficult one for me in this respect at least. But that said, the main plot is spectacular, and all those subplots, like I said, do feed into it and do all matter at some point. So I do have to acknowledge that that's more of a personal complaint on my part. I don't think, at least from the reviews that I've been reading and the reviews that I have looked at of this series in the past, I don't know that that's something other readers will necessarily struggle with. I think that's more of a me thing overall. So plot, also pretty solid here. Next is writing style. So Fonda Lee's writing style is so straightforward and easy to follow, which is so refreshing for a fantasy series. There are so many fantasy books that I read where I feel like the prose is so flowery and poetic, and there's just so many things being described that you have a hard time following, or you can have a hard time following what's going on. But Fonda Lee does not mess around. She gets right to the point. It is very cutthroat, it's very brutal, it's very exact in the way that she does it. So it matches the style of the story overall, which I really appreciate. It mimics, the fantasy world that it's set in, and it's so easy to follow because of that. It's similar to the cast of characters where there's just so much going on in this world, in the plot, with the characters. So much is happening, but it never feels overwhelming because of the way that she writes it. And one element in particular with this is something that I noticed later on, is that there is so much info dumping that happens in the series, but it never feels like info dumping. The amount of cultural and historical context that she was able to squeeze into the scenes between dialogue and brief descriptions and just interactions between characters, it fits so seamlessly where you never feel like she is just sitting down and explaining something to you, even though she is just sitting down and explaining something to you. So that, I thought, it was just such a mark of what a great writer she is, where there's just so much information that is just handed to you on these pages, but it never feels like you are being spoon-fed that information because of the way it is presented. So yeah, that, I was very impressed by it, and I really appreciated it, that it was sneaky and subtle enough where even though that's totally what was happening, it never felt like that, and it was always interesting. Again, like I said, her style really reflects the story, and even though I'm one to usually enjoy the prettier prose or the more poetic writing, I liked that her writing style was a bit more brutal and sharp and clear cut because it reflects the fantasy world that it's set in, it reflects the story that's happening, it reflects these characters. Her language choices were so clearly made in favor of presenting the story as what it is. The world and the characters are so rich and tangible and clearly presented, and it's done in such a way that it feels believable and real without being overwhelming. It is clear to me why her books have been nominated for or won so many awards, because she's clearly very good at what she does. So writing style, I loved it. I thought it was very smart, very clever, suits the story so well, and she's just a fantastic writer. I have no complaints. Next up is setting and immersion. It was awesome. It was so good. This rocked. I am not usually an urban fantasy kind of gal. It's not that I don't like urban fantasy. I like urban fantasy well enough. It's just not normally what I pick up. I honestly don't know why that is. I just haven't, really. It's just not usually the fantasy subgenre that I'm reading in or working in. But this was such a good urban fantasy. It's so well done. Like I said in the section about her writing style, the world just feels so real and lived in, and she's so good about slowly expanding it with each book, where you get to explore a little bit more of the world each time, and done in a succession that allows you to absorb that information slowly, where suddenly you look back at book 1 and you go, oh my gosh, the world is so much bigger now that we're in book 3, but you barely even noticed it was happening. It stretches so wide, but it takes its time in a way where it doesn't feel overwhelming, and it just makes the world feel totally real. One of the things I specifically loved about the setting and immersion is how she presents the cultures of the different countries. So it's predominantly set on the island of Kekon in the city of Janlun, but seeing the way that she presents the cultural context of the other countries that eventually do get involved, it only serves to highlight the cultural significance of what's going on in Kekon, if that makes sense. She not pits them against each other, but she uses the differences between cultures to highlight what's going on with the main culture that we're focused on. And I thought that was just so smart and so cleverly done. I loved seeing those little tidbits where seeing how it's done in this country just highlights the way that the culture of this country that we're focusing in on is presented. It's a really clever and subtle world building tool, which I really appreciated. And the magic system is really straightforward and cool. I am not typically one who reads for magic systems. I like magic. Obviously, I'm a fantasy reader, but I know a lot of people really appreciate smart, more science-based magic systems, and they'll read hard magic more often than not. I don't necessarily look for that. I enjoy it and I appreciate it and I like when it's present, but I don't necessarily look for it. Looking at what I tend to enjoy and the stories that I tend to love, I think I lean, or I gravitate more towards soft magic stories. But this was such a cool magic system. And even though I could be wrong with my definitions here, I don't think I am, or just the way I've interpreted this, it leans more towards hard magic. There's pretty clear rules about what's going on, but it never felt overwhelming. I was able to understand it. That is my struggle with a lot of the stories that involve hard magic for me, is that I'm not super science-minded. That part of my brain is not super well developed, or it's just never been easy for me. So when it starts to look more like scientific rules, I get a little bit lost. I can appreciate what's going on, but I'm more there for the vibes than following the rules. But here, even though the rules were clear-cut and it was obvious that there were rules to what was being done, I was able to track what was going on. I was able to follow it, and it was just really fascinating. And I love that it was used to, again, another world building tool, the way that it influenced Kekkonese culture. Like it was so ingrained in everything about who they were and how they behaved and what they chose to do and the way they looked at the world around them. It, again, a very good world building tool, and it was so just intertwined with everything else going on. It was very smart and well done. I think this is also one of the strongest elements of the series, that the world itself feels so immersive. It's so easy to get lost in it. It's so cleverly done. It just feels real. It was very cool to see, again, the expansion of the world throughout the series as a whole, while also feeling so attached to the island of Kekon and to Janlun in particular, and just getting to see how well she presents this fictional world that doesn't feel fictional at all. And finally, pacing. Next to plot, pacing is what I struggled with the most. The slower pacing of the first 2 books really worked for me. I've said several times on this channel, I believe, that I am more of a slow-born girl to begin with. I like things that take their time. I like a lot of setup. I don't mind waiting for a payoff. So again, in the first couple books, the slower pacing really worked for me. I understood that we were always building to something, and the payoff was always really worth it to me. It was book 3 in particular that I really struggled with the pacing. It was a bit more episodic. And again, even though I knew payoff was coming, it wasn't always as satisfying for me in the third book. A little bit in the second book too, but mostly the third book. It made me lose really any sense of urgency to keep reading. Where the first 2 books, I really wanted to continue to get back to it, even if I didn't necessarily have the time. And it took me longer just because I was busy. I was always thinking about getting back to it. Where book 3, I could set it aside for a while and then come back to it later and be like, okay, I'll just pick up here. So yeah, the pacing felt a lot less urgent to me in the third book, and a lot of the way that she set it up, I just wasn't as much a fan of. Speaking overall though, for the entire series, the pacing is pretty good. You understand that she knows what she's doing, and she is very clearly planting seeds as she goes. And overall, the payoff for all those seeds that were planted and for all the slower pacing of, building up to something extravagant, it was all very worth it and was ultimately very satisfying when you look at the grand scope of the story. And she was good at chapter by chapter pacing as well. She was good at zooming into those character moments and then zooming out to the wider world and balancing those against each other, moving from a character scene to an action-packed scene or intertwining them as needed. So she knows how to do pacing. I will say that. I'm not saying that the pacing is bad. It just didn't necessarily work for me, especially in the third book, and that kind of bled into the way that I reviewed the series overall. So getting into my ratings, this is really easy this time. I gave each of these books a 4.25 stars. The series is excellent. I really cannot emphasize enough how impressed I am by it and how much I ended up enjoying it. It was my smaller frustrations with plot and pacing that ended up leading towards this 4.25 star ratings every time instead of bumping it up to that 4.5. But again, those are personal items that I think I struggle with as a reader that I don't think the wider audience that this book is aimed towards is going to struggle with or necessarily feel frustrated by. This is easily one of the best things I've read this year, both technically speaking and just as my enjoyment as a reader. It is very adult, so I don't recommend it to younger readers, but if you are older and this sounds like your cup of tea, I say go for it. I thought it was excellent. It's very smart, it's action-packed, it's immersive, it's gut-wrenching. You will feel so attached to these characters by the end, and I think you will really enjoy your time in this world. Okay, so moving on now to my spoiler-filled thoughts. If you do not want spoilers, you can go ahead and click away to the final timestamp where I conclude this video, but getting into my spoiler-filled thoughts, we're gonna start with Jade City, of course, so book 1. This is such a good opening. This might have been, do I want to say it's my favorite? This might have been my favorite in the whole thing. But then again, I often tend to like beginnings to stories. I like seeing where it starts and feeling that, nostalgia, especially when a story progresses so far, getting to, feel that kind of sense of aw towards the beginning, if that makes sense. It's a kind of a rambly way to put it. Yeah, this was such a good opening. I was so sad about Lon. Of all the characters, I related to him the most, and he died so early on in such a horrible way, such a tragic way. So I think that also lent to me struggling with feeling connected to characters in the first book, because the one that I did feel really connected to, was offed within the first half of the book, which made it difficult to feel super attached to the other characters. I felt his loss very acutely. That being said though, the character dynamics between the siblings, especially Hilo and Shay, I really loved. Even though I didn't necessarily feel connected to any particular characters besides Lon, I felt invested in the dynamics between characters, all the different relationships happening in the family. I really cared about those. So that was significant to me for sure. There were so many good twists and turns here too. Again, I wish I had taken time to go back and review this when I had first read it so that these thoughts were fresh in my head, because this is my last point already for book 1. But I love how she set up that expectation in book 1 that you shouldn't, become too married to any one plot point, one character, one idea, because anything can turn on a head immediately within a single sentence, within a single page. It's always surprising and shocking, and I love that that was set up in book 1 and that only continued to progress throughout the other books. So yeah, Jade City. Jade City was great. Next up, Jade War. Jade War was also great. I have more thoughts here, it looks like. My first one is Hilo killing Amy. I don't know if I can forgive him for that. I'm so glad Nico ended up in the family because of it, but yeah, that was a moment where it really solidified Hilo's brutality. Like, I knew he was brutal and a little unforgiving and a little scary at times, a lot scary at times, but that moment I was like, ugh. Actually gagged by that, completely shell-shocked. But I also love that. I love that she didn't shirk away from those moments of being like, no, this character is very brutal. He does not care. He will do what he believes is necessary, and if he has to kill her, he's gonna kill her. And that's frightening, but you know, that's Hilo. I also really appreciated Andon's whole arc in this series. I really liked Andon in the first book. He was one of my other favorites. Again, not necessarily that I related to him in any way, but I appreciated his character, and I was curious to see how he was going to develop. So I really liked that we spent so much time with Andon here. And oh my gosh, that ending with him and Wen almost dying, that was so frightening in the best way possible. The build up to that was so well done. I still remember too listening to Morrow's execution, because I listened to a lot of this in an audiobook, and I was driving towards an event, and my jaw was literally hanging open as I was driving. I could not believe it was happening, and it just broke my heart for poor Shay. The scene was, again, horrible in the best way possible. Like, it really got to me. And poor Kane. I'm pretty sure that was book 2. Again, it's all muddled in my head, but I'm pretty sure that was book 2. That was horrible. So gut-wrenching. There were so many tragedies in this book that I think really solidified my attachment to these characters, because I just hurt for them. I wanted them to stop having to deal with so many awful things happening, and they just couldn't catch a break. It made me really feel for them and care about them, because I wanted them to have a win after all of this tragedy and loss. All the tragedies in this installment, it made it hit a lot closer to home and made me a lot more attached to the series overall. And while I was a little frustrated by the pacing here, definitely not as much, again, as I was in book 3, but even though that was a small frustration here, I loved that we had so much time to work on character development in this book. I'm a character girl to begin with anyway. Again, this is where I really got attached to these characters, because my heart just consistently went out to them, and it's because we had those moments of slowing down and looking closely at these longer character development arcs going on in this book. So yeah, Jade War, also great. Finally, Jade Legacy. I have so many mixed feelings about this one, because this was the book I struggled with the most, and also, oh my gosh, that ending makes it almost all worth it. I think it does make it all worth it, but still, I really struggled with it. So let's talk about that. It was, again, the most frustrating book of the series for me, but also had some of my favorite moments in the whole trilogy, which is why it's such a mixed bag for me. The payoff was so beautiful, and I ended the book just with feeling so in love with the story as a whole, but again, I just had no sense of urgency to finish it. I was a little overwhelmed, I won't lie, with the things I had going on, but because of the weird pacing, or what I thought was weird pacing, I was able to just set it down and be like, I'll get back to it later. The episodic pacing was just so strange here. I didn't like it. I was used to the bigger time jumps from Jade War. Like, I understood that we were going to be going over several years of the story, but just us skipping months and months of time or years of time within a chapter, that I wasn't a fan. It made it feel just so stretched out and prolonged to me in a way that I didn't necessarily feel the build up as much, because we weren't zeroing in, we were skipping so much time. And so many of the subplots I just didn't care for. I know, like, again, the payoff happened, and it all, you know, works together in the end, but a lot of them, it took forever for me to really understand why I should care. And even when I knew I was supposed to, I was kind of like, okay, I guess. A pattern I started to recognize is every time it approached an interlude, the pacing really picked up, and those were some of the strongest moments in the whole series for me. So, like, the John Loon bombing, Rue's death, Tar's death, all of these things, like, when we picked up the pacing towards those moments, it was, you know, one of the best books in the entire trilogy to me. I thought those were incredibly well presented pieces of the story, and again, they made me really care about what was happening, but it took so long to get there. And I understood too that as soon as an interlude finished, it'd be like, okay, starting over. It felt like I was starting a whole brand new season. Like, if this was in a TV show, I was starting right at the beginning, and I'd have to wait again for the payoff later, and it just kept doing that over and over again. So I wasn't a fan. It wasn't really my thing. And again, I know, and I know, because this was something that was, you know, set up for me in book 1. I know Lee was always working towards payoff for that. She was always slowly building to something. But I didn't feel the urgency, and I didn't necessarily feel as forgiving, I guess, as a reader as I did in the first 2 books. Where the first 2 books I went, whoa, that was worth the wait. This one I was kind of like, okay, I guess. That said, the ending of the series, I was getting ready to leave for a trip. I had a few minutes before I was supposed to get in my car and drive away. And I was listening to the audiobook as I was getting ready, when I hit the assassination scene, and Hilo got hurt, and all that went down, and I think I literally stood there for a solid minute with my jaw hanging open, kind of like I did at Morrow's execution scene, and I just stared at nothing. And then I had to go on my trip and drive like it was nothing. Like, I wasn't, you know, consumed by thoughts of trying to figure out how the story was going to end, because there was like 2 chapters left at that point. But Oh my gosh, what a heartbreaking but perfect way to end the journey that this trilogy was. That final stretch of time in Jade Legacy was perfection. So again, this was such a mixed bag because you had that, but then you also had everything else. I don't know. I don't know what to do with Jade Legacy, but I gave it 4.25 stars also. I was so frustrated with this final installment while also being entirely just wowed by it, because even though I had those frustrating moments, the ending was so poignant and worth it that I could kind of forget the complaints for a little bit. Not entirely, but my overall feeling by the end was I was so glad to have read it. I loved these characters so much, and my heart, a little piece of my heart was still in K-Con and probably always will be. There are so many other scenes and moments I could talk about, but I don't want to talk for, 2 hours. And again, I really wish I had done a video for each of these books, and it's been an overwhelming couple of months. I didn't have the time. I wish I had. I think here on out, if I do series reviews, I want to make sure I'm actually notating all of my thoughts and feelings instead of just a quick little overview like I've been doing, because I want to be able to talk about more moments and more scenes and give more commentary. Again, there's so many incredible, smart things I could go on and on about at length, but I would need time to gather my thoughts, and I'm just not going to do that here. The main takeaways: this was so smart and well executed. Fonda Lee is such a good writer. I'm so impressed by her talent and skill, and it's obvious to me why this series won so many awards, why it's been nominated for so many awards. It is an award-winning series for a reason. These characters are so well written, like I said, and while it took me a while to get attached to them, it is ultimately what made the story meaningful to me. It was this family, it was the character development for each of the individual characters and their relationships with each other that overall made me just fall in love with these books. And again, as someone who doesn't normally read urban fantasy, this is one of the best fantasy settings I have encountered to date. It is so well fleshed out, it is so well presented. It feels real, it feels lived in, it feels like you could reach out and touch it. It feels like somewhere that could exist in the world, and I do appreciate that about it being an urban fantasy, is that it feels like home while also not feeling like home. Again, I don't necessarily recommend this to everybody. I don't think it will be everyone's cup of tea. There are a lot of scenes that are very difficult to read. It is very brutal, and again, very, very adult. Do not recommend it to younger readers, but if this sounds like something you would enjoy, if it sounds like all the kind of things you typically like to read and can handle, it's excellently crafted. I think it's well worth your time. So that's all my thoughts for the Green Bone Saga. They are very scattered and foggy because of how long it's been since I have read the first two books, and because my life is insane right now. And so all my specific thoughts are somewhere in the ether, but I loved these and I had a great time reading them. Moving on to what comes next. My July writing update video is next up on the list. That will be out sometime in the next 2 weeks, I think, right? Yeah, it's not the end of July yet. Yeah, I have time. That'll be the next video though, so keep an eye out for that. It is going to be a big one, so yeah, keep an eye out. After that, I do plan to do a review video for the Locked Tomb series, which I'm so excited about because those are probably some of my favorite things I have read this whole year, maybe ever. I don't know. I'm obsessed with them. I'm having such a fun time. So that'll be after that. And then I have another readathon coming up in August, so keep an eye out for that as well. It'll be quite a bit later in August, but that's to the general lineup of what's happening next on the channel. So thank you, as always, for tuning in. I appreciate you being here, sticking around, even though it has been a hot minute since I have done a review video. Thanks for watching this one. If you have read the Green Bone Saga, I hope you relate to my feelings and can understand where I'm coming from and enjoyed getting to hear someone talk about something that you perhaps also loved. If you've not read the Green Bone Saga, I hope this video was informative and interesting and maybe encourages you to go read it. Really appreciate you being here. As always, you can also find me on Goodreads and Instagram. Those are linked below, and if you feel so inclined, you can also subscribe below. Otherwise, that is all for today. Happy reading, happy writing, and I will talk to you all soon.